Hi, welcome to the Chico Bag Podcast, where we dive into conversations that inspire us to leave everything better than we found it. I'm Andy Keller, your host, and I'm passionate about creating a more sustainable world, one small or large step at a time. Whether it's reducing waste, protecting our oceans, or rethinking the way we consume, this podcast is your guide to actionable solutions for a brighter, cleaner future. Thanks for joining us today. I'm very excited to introduce my guest, Marcus Erickson. Dr. Erickson is an acclaimed scientist and author and advocate for ocean conservation. He co-founded the Five Gyres Institute, an organization dedicated to fighting plastic pollution through science, education, and policy and advocacy. And recently, he attended the Global Treaty for Plastic Pollution. And it's a pivotal event in shaping the future of plastic regulation worldwide. Dr. Erickson, Marcus, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Andy, thanks for having me.
So can you give everyone an idea of what is this meeting that was in Korea and who's involved and why is it important?
Yeah, it was quite amazing to sort of see how the sausage gets made when you're doing international policy. And this one specifically was the United Nations Treaty to End Plastic Pollution. It was decided, a couple of years ago that the world would pursue, that UNEP would pursue a treaty, a monumental moment that some global policy was going to happen. But then the devil's in the details, big time. There were 5 negotiation sessions. They figured 5 weeks in 5 locations around the world, they could then hash out a treaty. Well, the 5th negotiation session just happened in Busan, South Korea, and there were about 4,000 people, Andy, that converged on the city. 170 countries represented. There were more industry lobbyists than there were nations, 220 lobbyists, and I was one of about 75 scientists and part of the Scientist Coalition. Then yet other observers from NGOs around the world, from Break Free from Plastic, Surfrider, Greenpeace, and dozens of others. It was amazing, 4,000 people in one place, all to negotiate a treaty. And it was a week of countries getting together and sort of hashing out line by line what the treaty looks like. Like you would have a couple thousand people in the room, and they would say, okay, today we're going to look at paragraph 3, line 2, who agrees or disagrees or has a comment. And then 10 countries raise their hand. We think the and should be an or. It's like watching paint dry. So you had it's an amazing process. And then of these 170 countries, they form little groups. Like you had the African nations form a block, a voting block. So there's the EU. And then the Pacific Island nations, they have a common interest of trash washing their shores. They're one voting block. And then you had the Latin American and Caribbean nations form one block. And collectively, they all form this high ambition coalition. So most of the world wants a really strong treaty. But then you've got the other actors, the countries that are rich in fossil fuels, the petrochemical nations, like Saudi Arabia, like Russia, and Bahrain, Kuwait, and Iran. All these countries collectively, they don't want a treaty. And they want to derail the process. They want to distract and delay. They want the whole thing just to crumble. So what we watched happening was during this 1 week, this last negotiation session, every time someone would ask, okay, who has a comment on the treaty, you'd have Russia would stand up and say, well, we think, they'd pause for 5 seconds. There ought to be, pause 5 seconds. A treaty, pause. It was a delay tactic, trying to run out the clock. And then Saudi Arabia would raise their hand and they would say, we think this treaty, there were and uhs every 2 seconds, and they would just go on tangents. And you know what, Andy, it worked. They did stall the treaty. There's going to be a 6th negotiation session. They succeeded in stalling. But what they didn't expect was to galvanize the world. In the middle of the 1 week session, a press release was formed, 120 countries represented, and they all called for a high ambition treaty. You had like Panama and Rwanda representing their blocks, and then the EU, all this one table, 5 people representing 120 countries said, we do not want a waste management treaty. I mean, those words exactly. They were rejecting what this low ambition, this like-minded group was calling for. So the treaty ended, and I am cautiously optimistic. I know what the petrochemical countries are up against, what they want, but you got 120 countries came together in solidarity that want, and here's what they want. They want production caps. Let's not making so much plastic. They want to stop the trade of trash to poorer countries, from rich countries to poor countries. They want design standards. Stop making the stupid stuff, the bags, the bottles of single-use crap. And they want it to be legally binding, not voluntary. And this is common sense stuff. And I'm confident, I'm optimistic we'll get there. Cautiously optimistic, but optimistic.
So the United Nations, has had, success in the past with these international treaties. Probably the most famous one is, the ozone layer treaty that,
I'm going to say that, yeah.
And that was successful. It's probably the most successful one. But then you got things like the Kyoto Protocol for climate change. Like it seems like that's really not going very far. Is the plastic just kind of too big of an issue to tackle, or are too many people making money in the current status quo to make any change here?
I think that's exactly it. I think it's as an order of complexity. It was easy with the ozone layer to say, okay, it's CFCs, let's stop making those. And the cost versus benefit, it was undeniable and very simple, easy to understand, easy to legislate, and only affected one industry. With microbeads, and you were there part of, communicating the benefits of getting microbeads out of facial washes. It was one product. It was one industry washing microbeads on your face down the drain into waterways. The world said stop, and we stopped.
And microbeads are just plastic.
Yes.
So Marcus, you're at this convention. All the players are there. Russia is stalling. The oil producing countries are just running out the clock in the final hours. There was no agreement at the end.
So this treaty negotiation, it was 1 week in Busan, with, again, 4,000 people there, 170 countries, 220 lobbyists, 75 scientists. I was one of the scientist coalition, and the rest were NGOs from around the world. And we're all there, and we're watching Russia and Saudi Arabia and other of these like-minded countries, mostly oil producers, just running out the clock, and they were effective in doing that. At the end, it was 3 a.m., the very last day, that finally the UNEP said, okay, we're out of time. So there's going to be a negotiation session 5.2, which is a reconvening somewhere, maybe in Geneva or Oslo. They always choose a different country, different city, where they will convene again and try and get a treaty. So I've watched the media portray this as a failure. Not at all. As I mentioned, what I saw was this coalition of 120 countries that came together in the middle of the week. When they saw these stalling tactics from Russia and Saudi Arabia, they were the biggest stallers. They were just, I'm not sure if you heard this part when I explained earlier, the tactics. They were saying, every other word. They were spending 10 minutes on these tangents. When they talk in the plenary, they would stall like 5 seconds between words. So high schoolish, ridiculous, but they ran out the clock. But I saw 120 countries come together midweek, Panama, Rwanda, the EU, all these countries, to say to the world, we will not have a waste management treaty. We want a high ambition treaty that includes production caps, a legally binding treaty, no more trading trash, design standards, and EPR, producer responsibility on the end of life scenario of plastics. So I left being optimistic, cautiously optimistic, but I think we're going to get a treaty of the willing. 120 countries don't want what the oil producing countries are trying to do.
So really, these oil producing countries are selling the building blocks for plastic. They're making a ton of money selling virgin plastic building blocks. We have a ton of plastic in the environment. Very little of it is being recycled. However, this feedstock technically could be made in the new plastic. Could it not be?
It can be, and that's where, it gets really convoluted, is that, we've made over 10 billion tons of plastics since the 1950s. That's how much we've transformed fossil fuels into this long chain polymer called plastic. Very durable, and that's kind of the good and the bad of it. With 10 billion tons already out there, and industry is constantly saying recycle, recycle, recycle. Well, the world's saying, well, if it is recyclable in an economic sense, not technologically, a technological sense, which it is, economic sense, then recycle it, prove it. You don't need to make more. So production caps, which what the world wants to happen, is based on the fact there's 10 billion tons already out there. There's enough. If it is recyclable, figure out the economics and do it. Don't make more. But of course, that's not what the petrochemical companies and their host countries want. They want unlimited production. They want no regulation on the trade of materials, including waste materials. And they know that recycling is, while it's technically possible if you throw tons of money at it, economically, it doesn't pan out. It does not compete. Recycled material typically does not compete with virgin resins. It's so easy, and the system has been designed this way to be very easy to extract raw materials, make plastic, put out into the world. It's so much easier than having to recycle it. And also consider it's easy also because, who's paying for the management of plastic when it's waste? It's cheap because you and I as taxpayers, we subsidize all that waste management. We're paying to pick it up, to pull bags out of trees, to pull plastic bags off of fences, out of storm drains, to clean it up and then transport it to a MRF, material recovery facility, where it gets dealt with. And then mostly we're paying for the landfills where it's stored in perpetuity. So all those negative externalities we're paying for. That's why it's artificially so cheap. It's cheaper than recycled content. It's also cheaper than many biopolymers today that could be viable replacements.
So in other words, the plastics industry promotes recycling as the answer, but it really isn't economically feasible to do so. But it gives people kind of this feeling that it's okay because they're putting the plastic in the recycle bin.
Oh my goodness, yes, that has been such a myth that's been perpetuated by the industries that make plastics. And although it's technically it's recyclable, and I like some of the conversations coming from industry that's saying we want to make sure all plastic products are recyclable by 2025. That's been a tagline I've heard by many companies. And I want to change just one letter. Instead of saying recyclable, make it recycled. Commit to the complete lifespan, the complete circular economy. And they will not do that. They don't want to commit to it being recycled. They want to say recyclable, and that's really just a technological aspiration. It's not an economic reality. And that's why the system fails. The economics do not pan out for the recycling of most plastics in the world today. That's why the numbers, like in the US, it's like less than 10%, and they're getting lower and lower. Now it's less than 5% of all plastic produced actually get recycled. So when I hear people talk about, let's just focus on recycling, I'm like, no. You've had your chance. You've had half of a century to try and prove your economic case model, and you failed. So let's go to what works even better, all the upstream mitigations, all the reusables, the refillables, the remanufacturing business models. That's where the world is going. And that's what works.
I've thought a lot about this, and as a business owner and entrepreneur, like I'm always trying to make my products greener, make them out of recycled content. And in my world, virgin polyester fabric, which is what I make my bags out of, is cheaper than recycled content by a lot. And I always think, like, why is that? Like, it should technically be less expensive to take a plastic water bottle, grind it up, make it into polyester fabric than it is to pull oil out of the ground and go through that whole process to extract it and make it into polyester fabric. And what I've found is that there's billions of dollars in tax incentives that subsidize the oil extraction industry. It's very lucrative to invest in oil drilling as an investor because of these tax breaks. And this is at a national level. And it seems like recycling, the incentives and advantages really aren't at a federal level. They're maybe at a state level. And I'm wondering, like, if we were to level the playing field so that there was an economic incentive to do good versus bad, could that be part of the problem? And was that part of the discussion in this conference in Korea?
And it was in the context of EPR. So you're absolutely right that on the front end, there are subsidies as well. So, plastic production for raw materials is artificially cheapened on both ends. On the extraction, based on all these tax incentives, makes it cheap to extract the raw materials. On the back end, you and I as taxpayers, we pay for all the waste management. In an EPR model, in the extended producer responsibility model, if you are the company extracting fossil fuels to make a product, whether it's energy or chemistry, you are invested in the full life cycle. From the extraction raw materials, that's your business problem, not the public's. To the back-end waste management, you got to participate in collecting this material that you chose to use to make a product. The product end life, you got to be a player in that full life cycle. When you add those things to it, it is no longer cheaper than recycled goods. So you're right. If you level the playing field, we have to do that because I'm tired as a taxpayer for paying for polluting industries, those subsidies, and paying for waste management. I don't want to leave my kid with having landfills on the outskirts of town. I'd prefer a much different world. So yes, I think if you take away those artificial impacts on the price, the playing field gets leveled, and recycled goods have a chance to compete.
Is there the political will? So we've talked about it at an international treaty level. There's also advocacy work that could be done at a national or state level. A lot of the focus is on individuals and, what can you do as an individual? Oh, I'm going to use a reusable bag. I'm going to use a reusable bottle. However, doing these things is great, but you're playing the game on an unlevel playing field, that's tilted towards, the oil extraction or extraction economy. So what can we do? So as individuals, as companies, as, citizens involved in our local governments, like, what can we do to help create the change we want in the world? And create a playing field that's different than what we're playing in currently.
I know you get that same question all the time. What can I do, as an individual? And my answer is always the same. It starts with get organized. Find your like-minded, people around you in your neighborhood, and you'll find them easily. People that, hey, I don't like all that trash up against the fence near my kid's school, or at the airport, all that trash blowing around on the fence. I know people, you can find them nearby, organize, form your groups. Many already exist. You got Surfrider, Greenpeace, Nature Conservancy, a lot of groups that are working on this issue, and find out what are the touch points in your community. Start locally. For example, the bag ban in California took 10 years, but it took 10 years after there were already 100 cities that said, we don't want this plastic bag waste. We're tired of paying for all this cleanup, pulling bags out of trees, off of fences, and out of storm drains. So when local action happens, and it happens across the state, like in the case of California, the governor said, okay, I hear you, we're going to ban plastic bags. And it worked. And also it it actually feels great. It's empowering to work on a local level. And you can work in the direction of thinking in the big picture. I'll go back to microbeads again. That was all local actions. People saying, hang on a second, there are microbeads in my facial scrubs, these plastic little beads going down the drain into our local rivers. No, we don't want that. So I always tell folks, get involved, organize, or find who's already organized and join that team, make them stronger. And then part of that organizing, the actions, are getting involved in policy. There are a lot of groups that love to get before their local city council and say, we don't want this. I've been to so many city council meetings in supporting other organizations as a scientist to be a sort of expert testimony about it. And I've seen them show up. They bring the science, they bring the local problem they want to solve, and they bring students. They bring young people. I have been told to sit down by city council members and the mayor. I've never seen a kid being told to be quiet. So I always say, you want to get organized, bring everyone in your community. Kids, their voice is so powerful. And then you can see these campaigns, sometimes they're local or they're tied to national pushes as well. Like the whole microbead work that we did ended up putting a bill on the desk of President Obama back in 2015. He signed federal legislation. So we're seeing these things happen, when we organize. And the individual, yes, they can bring your own bag. You have to do that. That's the low-hanging fruit. That's just the entry. That's walking in the door. You bring your own reusables. Demonstrate the world you want. Then get organized and fight. And it's easy and it's fun and you get stuff done and you're proud of yourself for doing it.
That's great advice. I've always been inspired by young people when they speak out because, young people, I guess, need to really understand that their voice is probably more important and heard more than anyone else's voice, so it's pretty inspiring. I'm thinking like from a business perspective. So there's a lot of people that may be watching this that, either work at a place or, are responsible for purchasing items for their business. And I've seen a lot of workplaces where you got single use, coffee cup, in an office environment. You got purchasing decisions, for example, for like promotional products. And a lot of times what I've experienced is the low price. What's the lowest price? And how do you shift the perspective that instead of shopping for price, you're shopping for value? Like think of it like an investment. What is the highest return on investment for my dollars, rather than buying the cheapest thing? Do you have any advice on how companies can take a look at that?
It's interesting you bring that up because there are, of course, cost is important to a lot of companies, a lot of government agencies need to find the lowest price, put things out to bid. But is it the lowest price? Is that what we want? When we think of our bigger picture, our collective values, most companies have a mission or a vision or some core ethic that the company stands behind. When you make your purchasing decisions, you've got to reflect on that. That's got to be the window you look through, our values as a company when we make our decisions, because everything counts, everything matters. And I want to offer one example that really worked. I saw it was a middle school it was Thomas Starr King Middle School in Los Angeles. My wife, Anna Cummins, co-founder of Five Gyres, we both gave a talk there. The kids were so fired up. They were already fired up when they invited us to come speak and talk about our ocean expeditions. And we sat with them at lunch, and the kids were so full in their heads about, how do we save our environment and stop the pollution. And we sat and we had lunch. And they were each given a styrofoam tray. Each tray had a plastic cup of fruit cocktail, a plastic cup of coleslaw, one little plastic bag with a plastic spork and a plastic straw on this plastic tray. And it all went into a plastic garbage bag at the end. And the kids were like, this is not jive. It was pretty awesome to see these kids. They ended up washing all the styrofoam trays from a week of lunch, and they punched a hole in the bottom and made this like 30-foot long rectangular white styrofoam snake. this big thing. And they hung in the tree. The principal said, go ahead. You're inspired. Let's go for it. And the students ended up buying little baskets, reusable baskets, to hold their lunch in instead of a tray. They saved the school $12,000. And that got the attention of LA Unified School District Superintendent. And the students made the case. Two things they said. Our values, we're about education, and our lunch has to demonstrate, who we are as young students inheriting this world. It was that, and they were able to provide an economic model for change. So that superintendent, LA Unified School District, I met him 2 years later at that same school in front of cameras when he announced in front of the students that, okay, I heard you. Now we're going to ban styrofoam trays in every one of our 900 schools in the district. The students won. But that LA was able to combine their efforts with, I think, 5 other school districts across the country. And they found a vendor that could make a biodegradable paper tray called bagasse from sugarcane fiber at a similar price point to a styrofoam tray. And that got them all to collectively switch. So it was both. It was values, sticking to your values, that it's not okay to throw away all this trash when we're talking about how it impacts our human health and the environment. And they were able to be concerned with economics and bring the price point down to a similar price, maybe a little bit more than a styrofoam tray. They made the switch. That kind of thinking I think can apply across the board to all problems we see. So if you're in procurement for your company, your school district, your company's office, the military even, stick to your values. The values come first. And then, okay, how do we find an alternative, a change that both makes us feel good about ourselves and sticking to our core values, and it doesn't break the bank? And I think all across the board, those opportunities exist.
Well, that's inspirational, and it just makes me question, like, why are we using styrofoam anywhere if LA Unified, can make the switch, and they've got the cost of that place? Why would any school use styrofoam still when ultimately it can't be recycled and it's going to persist, for what, hundreds of years? Who knows how long?
In the landfill, thousands.
Yeah.
It's entombed like King Tut. It's not going anywhere. Well, it will begin to leach. It will chemically degrade a little bit and leach out styrene, which you don't want. So what's the issue? Like, we talked about like what we're doing about plastic, but can you tell everyone just kind of what is the core issue, right? Plastic in a landfill, you hear that, oh, it's inert, it's sealed. There's not really an issue. We can mine it later. Like, it's not a problem. So what is the problem with plastic, and why is it should it be a concern to everyone? Well, I think I go immediately to environmental and human health and economic health. All those three things combined. We talk about economics. It costs a lot to manage waste. It never goes away. Plastics used in some industries is fine, in technologies and in architecture. I mean, half of our cars and our buildings are synthetic materials. There is an economic cost to all the waste we generate from the single-use throwaway stuff. And that's very, very costly. But the most important thing I consider is the environmental and the human health side of things. The environmental challenges are well documented, and you've joined our expeditions, Andy. You've seen for yourself, middle of the South Pacific, where we documented together for the first time the South Pacific subtropical gyre. We saw lots of trash washing up on shore on Easter Island. We've seen their true cost, environmental cost of entanglement, animals getting wrapped up in fishing gear, ingestion, animals consuming plastics and taking away pollutants off of plastics as they're trying to digest it into their bodies. A few years back, I documented plastics on land. I think I've showed you the camel polybezoar, this big mass from a camel's stomach. So imagine a 50-pound wad of plastic bags in a camel's gut, displacing where food and water need to go, causing ulcers in the stomach, lacerations of the esophagus, and a very toxic environment where there's all kinds of sepsis happening and all chemicals leaching. So the suffering of wildlife around the world, land and sea, is justification enough. But add to that human health. So some folks aren't as convinced by the poor sea turtle and the whale, but consider your kids. There's growing evidence, a lot of evidence already of the exposure in our bodies to micro nanoplastics, inside and out. When I say inside, I listened to a scientist who gave a lecture in Korea just last week. Her latest research showing that nanoparticles of plastic that enter our nasal passages through breathing can cross through the sinus lining, right past a thin layer of bone into your brain, cross the blood-brain barrier. Nanoplastics in your brain. That's new. We already know there's nanoplastic, microplastics in the human placenta. Before you're even born, you're exposed to these nanoplastics. It's in the arterial plaque in the hearts of people. It's found in organs around the body. It can get through the gut into the blood and be transported everywhere. So our exposure is very well documented. One data gap is in the level of harm. If it's in your brain, does it cause harm? I prefer the precautionary principle, like, okay, that's horrible enough. I don't think my brain, whether it causes problems or not. In arterial plaque, we found in this study, that nanoplastics in arterial plaque, that the people that had more micro nanoplastics in their arterial plaque had a higher likelihood of heart disease than those that didn't. So that's one bit of evidence showing not just exposure, but harm. So I think that data is growing. So there is significant harm that can happen to the environment and to people from this excess plastic waste in our environment, in and around our homes, all the synthetic fibers blowing in the air around your house, all the plastics leaching from containers into the products. And it's not just the plastic polymers, it's also all the chemicals that are added to plastics that also leach out. Like a rubber ducky, for example, those soft, pliable plastics you let kids put in their mouths. The only reason it's flexible is because you take PVC, like what your pipes are made of, hard plastics, add phthalates to it, it becomes flexible like a rubber ducky. Phthalates are a known endocrine disruptor. They feminize males in utero. So there are many chemicals, thousands of chemicals added to plastics that come off the plastics when they're in our bodies, in our environment, that exacerbate the problems of plastics. So being a scientist, having done this for 20 years, the evidence, because I know it, is overwhelming that we need to regulate plastics. And the High Ambition Treaty, all the points they make are spot on. You need to put a production cap, stop making poorly designed products, stop the trade of trash from rich countries to poor countries, EPR, and make it a legally binding treaty. That's all consistent with what we know about the harm coming from plastics to people on the planet.
So if I was to sum up what you're saying, it's, plastic, once it's created, it's very hard. It basically never goes away. The economic model for recycling isn't in place until producers take responsibility for the end of life of the product. And these subsidies for the extraction are also shared with the recycling industry. Leveling the playing field economically. There's a health impacts of plastic, which, is devastating now, but even more so, it's kind of like compounding issue into future generations. So it seems like we have a moral imperative, as humanity, as caretakers of this planet, that we're passing on to future generations to take action. And it seems like a very simple step based on our conversation today is just to, when we're going to use plastic, use it in a way that's responsible. That, if you're going to use something that lasts for eons, make sure you get a good life out of it, and it's not just used for minutes, such as the case of a plastic bag or plastic bottle. single-use plastics that are unnecessary seem like the lowest hanging fruit. And I'm wondering, like, for people who are watching this, what would be your last thought in regard to takeaways or inspiration that people can walk away with, something that's actionable for them today?
Again, for the individual, just to get organized, there are so many local groups to get involved with, and I urge everyone, either you support them with your time or send a few dollars their way so they can keep doing their work, because that's where there's power. Locally, there's power in getting organized. Join a group, get in front of your local city council. But then, and I think about, you as an entrepreneur, and you're thinking of, how to keep your business alive, but also stick within your values. And I know you well, and I know that, your inspiration, you saw all this plastic bag waste in the world, and you didn't want that for the future, for your kids, for my kids. We want a better world. Yeah. So how can you run a viable business and have, and absorb those negative externalities that are costly, not cause harm? Make sure your products, design them, or use more expensive materials, use more expensive design criteria to make the right product in the first place, which you've done with ChicoBag. So you're a shining example of advice I would give to, CEOs is, reflect on your values. I think when another CEO, and I'm sure you know who he is, Ray Anderson, and I think it's Innovative Carpeting at the company. But Ray Anderson, he had read a book, I forget who wrote it, about the true cost, the true life cycle of products. So for years, his company, they made carpeting. And carpeting has all kinds of adhesives and glues and different kinds of chemicals to make the carpeting, different polymers all stuck together, 100% unrecyclable. And if you wear out a path from your front door to the kitchen, you replace the whole roll. It all goes right to a landfill. And all the chemicals on the front end might harm workers. All the chemicals on the back end are there, they'll live forever. And he thought, what's a different way? As a CEO, he can make some drastic changes. So he went from being a business model that makes a product as cheap as possible, sells it, and never washes their hands of responsibility. He said, we're going to transform this multi-billion-dollar company, this industry, and we're going to make carpet squares. And we're going to make them with monomaterial, so it's more recyclable. We're going to find some adhesives that aren't chemically intensive, aren't harmful, and their business is thriving. And what his business model shifted from that linear economy, how can I change my business to where I have a relationship with my customer? And when the worn carpet squares are worn out, we'll replace those. And maybe they have a next door neighbor wants carpet squares. Maybe their school, their office, or they'll change in 10, 20 years, they'll change their mind and we'll replace, half those squares and we'll take it all back. That is an awesome example of a shift from linear thinking as a CEO to circular thinking, and embrace your customer as a long-term relationship. I don't see why that can happen across the board. You've done it. And I think others can too. So the advice would be for the individual, get organized. For the CEO, get real on the full life cycle of what you're creating.
Excellent advice, Marcus. I appreciate you so much taking the time to be on our first podcast and to share your insight and wisdom with everyone who's listening. So thank you so much. So many other topics we can discuss, but we'll hold that for a future date. Thank you so much, Marcus.
My pleasure, Andy. What an honor. Thank you.